Paris, August 1944. You know the images, right? The sweltering summer heat, the joyful crowds, the romanticized triumph of a city finally casting off its oppressors. But what if I told you that the real story is much darker, a lot more complex, and honestly, infinitely more fascinating? In this explainer, we're going to conduct a real historical investigation to shatter those romanticized myths. We're reconstructing the liberation of Paris not as some simple victory parade, but as a high-stakes, multi-layered geopolitical thriller. We've got to open with a staggering paradox. How did a city that was slated for absolute destruction by one side and entirely bypassed by the other suddenly become the epicenter of a frantic race for power? To understand the pure chaos of August 1944, we have to realize that history isn't just a sequence of inevitable facts. It's driven by human ambition, fear, and deeply competing motives. Let's dive into Part 1, the city nobody wanted, and the strategic illusion surrounding it. To unravel this mystery, we have to look at Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower. To him, Paris wasn't some glittering prize to be won. It was a dangerous strategic trap, based on cold, hard military logic. His primary objective was the rapid defeat of Germany. Engaging in a protracted, block-by-block urban battle in Paris offered zero military advantage. And even worse, if they liberated the city, the Allies would instantly become responsible for feeding and fueling millions of civilians. That threatened to bleed their supply lines completely dry. So militarily, the smartest move was simply to go around it. Which brings us to Part 2, the race for sovereignty and de Gaulle's absolute nightmare. While the Americans just wanted to ignore the capital, General Charles de Gaulle realized that leaving Paris in limbo meant risking the very soul and sovereignty of a post-war France. He found himself fighting a desperate two-front political war. If he didn't assert control and quickly, France faced two terrifying alternatives. On one side, you had AMGO, the Allied military government, which would literally treat France as an occupied administrative zone run by the Americans. On the other side, the local internal resistance in Paris, heavily armed and dominated by communist revolutionaries known as the FTP. If de Gaulle delayed, France would either be ruled by foreign military governors or fall to an uncontrolled leftist revolution. So, the crucial question here is, what do you do when the most powerful military alliance on Earth is ignoring you? How could de Gaulle force their hand? Well, he played his final card. He threatened to shatter the entire chain of command by sending General Leclerc's French 2nd Armored Division into the city independently if Eisenhower kept delaying. Moving into Part 3, the spark of rebellion and how a city erupts. But before de Gaulle could maneuver his armies on the geopolitical chessboard, human nature took over. The restless, starving people of Paris forced a breaking point. Just watch how quickly a society can unravel. On August 15th, metro employees and the police go on strike. The very next day, postal workers join in, completely severing official communications. By August 17th, the collaborationist Vichy government panics and literally flees the city. And then on August 18th, what started as a simple railway and police strike rapidly snowballs into a general strike and an uncontrollable citywide armed insurrection, heavily directed by communist commander Colonel Roltanguy. Overnight, the cobblestone streets of Paris became a bloody battleground. Ununiformed resistance fighters of the FFI were out there openly attacking a completely bewildered German garrison. The Germans suddenly found themselves trapped in their own occupied city, unable to even leave their strongholds without being shot from rooftops and apartment windows. The crack of rifle fire echoed through the boulevards as the situation spiraled entirely out of control. That leads us to Part 4. Defiance and desperation, and the infamous wrecker of cities. Inside the burning city, the German military governor, General Dietrich von Schultitz, a man historically known as the wrecker of cities, faced a brutal ultimatum from Berlin. Hitler demanded the systematic destruction of Paris's historic landmarks and bridges. The order was absolute, a field of ruins. Yet Schultitz surprisingly hesitated. Why would a man literally known as the wrecker of cities suddenly refuse to wreck one? The romantic post-war myth loves to say that Schultitz spared Paris out of pure sentimental love for its beauty, but the hard military reality of his garrison completely shatters that narrative. He practically lacked the explosives needed to bring down those massive monuments. His armor consisted of obsolete, captured French tanks. His artillery was virtually non-existent after the heavy losses in Normandy, and his men, they were demoralized and utterly trapped by thousands of insurgents. Surrounded, cut off from reinforcements,
Schultitz made a deeply human calculation. He had recently met with the Führer and recognized that Hitler was, frankly, mentally unstable, and the war was undeniably lost. He chose self-preservation over suicidal destruction. Attempting to carry out Hitler's apocalyptic order with a third-rate garrison would have only guaranteed his own immediate annihilation by the resistance or the advancing allies.
Now for part 5, the Spanish vanguard, and the very first to arrive. As the situation inside Paris completely boiled over, Eisenhower finally relented, dispatching the French 2nd Armored Division. But when Captain Raymond Trone's vanguard breached the city limits, there was a massive historical twist. Out of 160 men in this leading French company, a staggering 146 of them were actually exiled Spanish Republicans. These were battle-hardened men who had been relentlessly fighting fascism since the outbreak of the Spanish Civil War. But there's a hidden, profoundly uncomfortable reality behind why they were there. The French 2nd Armored Division had actually been systematically stripped of its black African colonial troops. Why? To meet strict American and British racial requirements for the liberating force. The division was whitened. Black soldiers who had fiercely fought for free France were replaced by white soldiers and foreign volunteers, like these Spanish veterans. It's a striking, sobering example of how political and social forces physically shape the makeup of historical events. Which brings us to our final section, part 6, the myth of liberation and writing the history. By August 25th, the actual military battle was over. But addressing the jubilant crowds, de Gaulle delivered an absolute masterclass in political theater. Listen to this famous declaration. He says, "Paris was liberated by itself, by its people." Notice what's missing there. He deliberately erases both the massive Allied armies that made the approach possible and the communist resistance fighters who actually bled in the streets. He did this for one specific reason: to project absolute, unified state power and cement his own legitimacy. And de Gaulle knew that words alone wouldn't secure his fragile new government against the heavily armed communists still roaming the city. So, to enforce his political dominance, he requested Eisenhower to march an incredible number of troops right down the Champs-Élysées just days later. 30,000 heavily armed American soldiers paraded through the city. It wasn't just a celebration. It was a massive, calculated show of force to quietly crush any lingering thoughts of a leftist uprising. So the crucial takeaway here is that this carefully constructed myth, the story of a purely self-liberated unified capital, wasn't just political spin. It was a necessary fiction. France desperately needed this exact narrative to heal the deep psychological trauma of the Vichy collaboration, to restore national pride, and most importantly, to reclaim its sovereignty and secure a seat among the victorious Allied powers in the post-war world. As we step back from the chaotic, multi-layered reality of August 1944, it leaves us with one really profound question to consider. When historical facts collide with the psychological needs of a broken nation, is the unifying myth sometimes more important than the messy truth? How much of the history we accept today was crafted not from objective facts, but from the desperate need of nations to rebuild their identities from the ashes? It completely changes how you look at the past, doesn't it? Thanks for diving into this explainer with me, and remember, never stop questioning the narrative.